Hey, good morning on this not so ordinary Wednesday morning. The world and the Middle East is in shock. Reverberating is the press conference that President Trump had with Bibi Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, yesterday at the White House. And firstly, to see the way the Prime Minister was welcomed during the election, the Vice President didn't even want to meet with Prime Minister Netanyahu. And since October 7th, when Israel suffered the worst day since the Holocaust, instead of being welcomed and embraced, we were treated like pariahs. We were treated like we are the guilty ones. But everyone's up in turmoil. President Trump said that all the 1.8 million people that live in Gaza should leave to greener pastures and should live in a place where there won't be death and destruction. I don't know the answer. But one thing for sure that everyone could agree with, that what's worked and what's been tried, for 75 plus years and has failed cannot be done again. As the famous quote attributed to Einstein, which he never said, by the way, that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. We failed time and time again. Just since 2000, Israel was forced for years to be convinced that if we gave Hamas money and economy, that they would never do anything to devastate that, and that they would not do terror attacks. Then October 7th came. After we let people in from their hospitals, we let them come into work. We had volunteers from Israel going to help the people there. They had all the money in the world. And what did they do? October 7th. They took babies, the Bibas kids. They raped, they killed, and they murdered. 5 days after October 7th, Blinken admits that he came to Israel and he told Israel, if you don't let aid into Gaza, we won't help you win the war. And the 5th day, there wasn't an aid issue yet. There wasn't hunger. But yet Israel was always put in the corner. The world, and especially Europe, would prefer to work with Hamas again, even after October 7th. No one's ready to think out the box. As I mentioned to you earlier, this week we read about the exodus of Egypt. And the Torah says, Vayasev Elikim es Yisrael derech hayam suf. God took the Jews in a roundabout way. That what? That in case the Jews change their mind and say they want to go back to Egypt, that it should be difficult for them. But how would they go back? They just suffered for 200 years in slavery. Why would they consider going back to Egypt? And of course, today we know what's the Stockholm Syndrome, which is that sometimes when you're oppressed for so many years, you come back to your oppression. You don't see any other way. And that's the story with Israel, and that's the story with everyone in the Middle East. We're so used to the terror, to the hate that's been going on against the Jewish people for 75 years that we can't see a way out. A place that educates their children in the textbook to kill Jews, that puts suicide vests on babies, that celebrates. We watched what happened when the hostages came out, and thousands of Hamas people, not just those fighting, but people in Gaza celebrated and terrorized the hostages. So, listen, the answer is not clear. But one thing is clear, and that's what the president did yesterday. He says, we can't think this way again. We have to come up with a different solution. There is no way that Hamas could stay in any whatsoever way in the Gaza Strip. Israel, for years, has absorbed 7 million Jews from all over the world. Over 500,000 that were evicted and expelled from Arab countries. Let's see the Arab countries welcoming some of their brethren. In fact, everyone's screaming, but today when they interviewed the people in Gaza, Most of them said if you gave us a place where we got health insurance and future education for our kids, and there were other Palestinians, we would run. You don't have to force us out. Open the borders of Gaza and let us out. But yet, the world wants to do what it did with UNRWA. It took an organization, and instead of after the Independence War, when 5 nations tried to kill Israel instead of making peace, instead of taking those Palestinians and sending them to places where they could start new lives, we let them remain refugees. And we spent close to $1 trillion over those 80 years, making sure they stayed in that state of mind, so that no one should ever want to start a life, so that they should want to come back to Israel and destroy Israel. This can't go on anymore. We need to think differently. And most importantly, as Amit Segal wrote in the Wall Street Journal, in an op-ed, how could we even fathom that Hamas could do the October 7th, the worst day since the Holocaust, not just with their fighters, but with citizens from Gaza, and expect there should be no repercussions? You lose an election, there's repercussions. You start a war and you lose the war, there's repercussions. Going back to the status quo, giving them back all their land after what they did, what kind of message does it send for the future? So to me, I hail yesterday's press conference. I hail the way the Prime Minister was treated, the dignity that Israel got as a true ally and the greatest ally of America. I hail that we're thinking in a new way, that we're not ready to go with what's happened before, with the status quo. And we're going to have the courage and the strength to think differently. And all those Jews screaming, how could we expel Gazans? Where were they when Jews were expelled from Gaza in the early 2000s? Where were they throughout all this? We have to have the courage and the bravery to think different. Because if we want peace in the Middle East, it's going to need to take a mind change. Because the Stockholm Syndrome is strong. And as the Torah teaches us in this week's Torah portion, by Yasef Elokim, God took the Jews on a roundabout way, because he recognized that although they left Egypt, the slave mentality was still there. Us Jews and the world have the courage not to go with that slave mentality. And yes, today, the Europeans and all the people in the Middle East are screaming, this is terrible. But trust me, they're thinking differently. And they're thinking, we better figure out a solution or this is going to happen again. Israel has to remain strong and steadfast. Fight to get every hostage out, but also fight to annihilate Hamas till the end. We can't leave them in Gaza. There is no way that Hamas could continue. God bless you. Have a great day, and may we have more days like today.